Right, it looks like most people have connected, so we will get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you to the Low Income Energy Network's annual conference for 2023. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is April Wepler, and I am the engagement coordinator at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. The theme of this year's conference is turning up the heat on the right to cooling. We have a great agenda and some really wonderful speakers lined up for you today. Before I pass it over to Z, I just want to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands and waters on which we live and work are the traditional territories since time immemorial of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge that Indigenous communities across Canada have distinct cultures, traditions, and lifestyles. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these lands and waters. We recognize that we have a great deal to learn and a significant amount of work to do to address historical and ongoing environmental injustices imposed on Indigenous peoples, including the denial of access to justice. For myself, I am very grateful to live on the banks of the Speed River. I live on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee people and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Six Nations of the Grand Watershed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Z, and I run the Low Income Energy Network, which is a joint program of CELA and ACTO. CELA is the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and ACTO is the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario. Both ACTO and CELA are specialty legal clinics funded by Legal Aid Ontario. For those of you who are new here today and don't know who we are, here in Ontario, LIEN is widely recognized as the primary go-to organization with expertise on low-income energy issues. LIEN was formed in 2004, and we're a network of over 60 member organizations across Ontario, comprised of community legal clinics, anti-poverty groups, affordable housing groups, environmental and social justice groups. As a network representing the intersection of interests related to low-income consumers and energy and sustainability, our focus is on reducing the energy bills of all low-income consumers and also ensuring that they're provided with the opportunity and tools to better manage their energy bills. About 18 years ago, LIEN developed a vision for a comprehensive strategy for reducing energy consumptions and costs for Ontario's vulnerable low-income households. Through our persistent advocacy work with the Ontario government and the Ontario Energy Board, we were instrumental in bringing our vision to reality. We now have programs that help low-income consumers reduce their energy use through the introduction of free energy efficiency upgrades in their homes. We have low-income customer service rules that utility companies offer, such as security deposit exemption, waiving of disconnection and connection fees, a fairly generous arrears repayment agreement. We have an ongoing rate affordability program that provides low-income electricity customers with an on-bill monthly credit. We also have an emergency financial assistance fund for low-income consumers who are in arrears or facing disconnection. Now on to the reason we're all here today. LIEN's annual conference is an opportunity to exchange ideas and learn from each other in an effort to ensure that low-income Ontarians are able to meet their basic energy needs affordably and sustainably. Last year's conference introduced the impact of extreme heat on vulnerable and marginalized communities. This year, we will continue the discussion around municipal advocacy on the Maximum Heat campaign, present you with our model bylaw, introduce case studies of tenant protections and successful advocacy in other jurisdictions, and also look at opportunities for immediate action at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels. Reducing heat vulnerability requires government responses and community level responses cutting across a number of sectors, including public health, emergency management, social services, critical infrastructure, and housing. But it also requires an equity-based approach to all decision making. Our presenters today are going to explore all of these different themes. We're going to start our day with presentations. move on to a panel discussion at around 1:45, breakout rooms at around 2:30. And our facilitator, Abhi, will guide us through the day and keep us all on track. I am going to pass it on to Abhi right now. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much, Z, for that introduction, folks. My name is Abhi. I am a research manager at Efficiency Canada. I lead research on energy poverty and low-income energy efficiency policies, but I also am on the steering committee of the Low-Income Energy Network. I will be your MC and your moderator for today. So one thing I do want to do before we get rolling is talk a little bit about, maybe give a little bit of context for this year's LIEN conference. So last year when we all got together, we talked about actions that can be taken for the right to cooling. And this year we're moving on to thinking about policy advocacy, and like turning up the heat on the right to cooling. And sometimes the right to cooling is presented as a paradox. You will hear people say, how can we cool homes in a warming climate? And does it contribute to warming the climate? And LIEN has a position on this. I'm going to try to articulate it here in a few short minutes, but our position statement or position paper will be on our website by the time these presentations go up. So the first thing about the right to cooling is that we shouldn't villainize the vulnerable. What I mean by that is low-income households, seniors, single parents living in rental housing are not the problem. Vulnerable Canadians are not energy hogs. They don't use a lot of energy in their homes. They're not the ones with pools in the backyard and things like that. So when we talk about the right to cooling and the impacts of more air conditioning on the grid or on our climate, let's not villainize the vulnerable. And the burdens of a warming climate are primarily borne by most vulnerable Canadians. If you recall, a couple of years ago when we had an extreme heat event in BC and Alberta, around 800 people died as a result of that. A vast majority of them were seniors living in rental apartments, and 98% of people who passed away, I believe, died in their own homes. So the challenges of a warming climate are borne by the most vulnerable, and we shouldn't be villainizing them when we talk about the right to cooling. You will often also hear passive cooling as a solution, things like green rooftops or tree covers, and LIEN has consistently been advocating for those things in the long term, but people are dying today, and we need to be putting all options on the table to save lives today. Cooling also increasingly is aligned with climate and net zero pathways. So for example, you'll see in some of our presentations today how cooling with modern technology like heat pumps that can do both heating and cooling can be an entry point into decarbonizing homes for all Canadians, especially the most vulnerable Canadians. If we are to get to our net zero 2050 goals, the road to that will have to go through every single home. We will have to figure out how to decarbonize homes in Canada, and heat pumps can serve as an entry point into decarbonizing heated homes, because heat pumps can do air conditioning, cooling, while also heating in the winters. And the last point is that heat pumps alone can't be an effective cooling solution or a climate solution. We need to build a thermal resilience in households. And so policies have to be aligned in such a way that by building, so thermal resilience means, if you're having an extreme weather event or if you lose power for a number of days, how long can your home stay warm or cool? How less energy do you need to keep your home warm or cool? So the solutions can't just be giving everyone a free heat pump, even though certain programs today are doing that, but we need to think more actively about combining heat pumps with other solutions that address whole home retrofits and keep homes more thermally resilient, so low-income households can warm or cool their homes using less energy and less resources. So this is LIEN's position on this. And for more detail and for references, you can look at our position paper, which will be over on our website by the time this is done. Jackie is with CELA, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and Jackie today will talk to us about the work that CELA and the Low Income Energy Network have done over the past 2 or 3 years on maximum heat bylaws. Take it away, Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Is my screen sharing well? Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Jackie. I'm a lawyer at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. So Z has introduced CELA. We're one of the legal aid clinics that co-runs LIEN, and our mandate is focused on environmental equity, justice, and health. We also have a charitable arm, which is the Canadian Environmental Law Foundation, and that's focused more on education and archiving environmental law history. To kick off my presentation, I wanted to try to offer a definition or a starting point for a definition of environmental racism and environmental justice. They're very difficult concepts to define, but what these definitions that I've put in my presentation are trying to capture is a few different pieces: the higher burden of environmental harm on Indigenous and racialized communities in Canada, and also on the flip side, uneven access to environmental benefits, to programs that are designed to assist with environmental, like heat pump programs, so environmental benefits. Fair treatment is a key aspect of the definition of environmental justice, and it requires meaningful involvement of all communities and people in environmental decision making, again, in terms of the burdens of pollution and environment on different communities, and decision making about environmental benefits and programs. Environmental injustice in our communities takes several different forms. I've listed some. So for instance, polluting industry being located disproportionately close to under-resourced communities, less access to meaningful public participation, for instance, because of unreasonable burdens on under-resourced communities. So there's too many consultations. They don't have resources. There's not money to participate. People aren't being compensated for their time. All of those burdens are part of environmental injustice. There's lower levels of enforcement in under-resourced communities. And interestingly, one I wanted to highlight, which I think is important, and what Abby was getting at in his introduction, what I put on the slide is increased pressure or rhetoric about accepting conditions that wouldn't be accepted in other communities. So what I put on the slide was, for instance, about accepting polluting industries near those communities. But in terms of the right and the discussion that we're having today about access to heat, under-resourced communities are expected, or they're spoken of, about enduring conditions that the rest of us don't subject ourselves to and don't think we need to. So there's no limitations, for instance, on active cooling if you can afford it in our community. Climate change is a very serious environmental justice issue. And I like to say that in terms of thinking about the crisis, it's important to think about it as an environmental crisis, a public health crisis, and an equity crisis at the same time. The IPCC has long recognized different dimensions of equity in talking about climate change. One of the ways that they talk about it that I think is quite interesting is they talk about pillars of equity. They talk about equity between countries and between generations, so intergenerational equity. And then the third pillar, which is kind of most key to our discussion today, is between people within communities based on environmental justice considerations like indigeneity and racialized communities, but also on income levels as well. In its recent 2023 synthesis report, we were really pleased to see this focus on equity and talking about how to move on mitigation and adaptation measures that we so desperately need to deal with the climate crisis. And finally, I did want to point out that our Supreme Court recently, in the carbon pricing decision, also highlighted the disproportionate burden of the climate crisis on low-income communities. I highlighted paragraph 206 of that decision, which notes the irreversible harms to the environment that would be borne disproportionately by vulnerable communities and regions. And they highlight in this paragraph Indigenous people, the people living in the Canadian Arctic and northern regions and Canada's coastal regions. I think, as we all know, extreme heat is a really serious health concern, and it can cause very disproportionate impacts on particular groups. So seniors, infants and children, people suffering from certain chronic illnesses or taking certain medications can affect your body's ability to recognize the impacts of heat, and people with social disadvantage. And as Abby mentioned, what's really striking about the reports that came out of Quebec's 2018 heat event and British Columbia's 2021 heat event is, first of all, how similar they were to each other in terms of who was impacted, but also the fact that it really is about people dying in their homes, in the units where they live. And so in our view, in LIEN's view, we need a solution that addresses that head on. How do we make the units, the places where people are living, livable and safe? So moving on to the law reform project that CELA has going on, it's focused on climate change in vulnerable communities. And we've written a series of reports that looks at different legal options and tools available to try to assist with adaptation measures to deal with some of the worst impacts of climate on vulnerable communities. And so there's a bunch about flooding and green roofs and urban tree cover that I highly recommend to all of you, of course. But the focus today will be on maximum temperature bylaws. One of the key focuses of this project has been on collaboration at the local level with other groups working on climate justice issues and other legal aid clinics. And for the most part, we've been focusing on municipal power to act on climate, with the recognition that this is definitely an all hands on deck situation. All levels of government need to be doing the utmost within their jurisdiction to be assisting with the climate crisis. But there is momentum and interest at the municipal level, which we think is a good opportunity for a focus for advocacy. That being said, the first point I just wanted to make quickly is, in terms of Ontario, we don't have good data that tracks heat related death. And so this is a provincial piece to this. Currently, the Ontario Coroner's Office doesn't accurately track and doesn't capture heat related death unless it's a very kind of sort of very obvious heat related death, for instance, a child being left in a car and that kind of thing. So those types of death may be captured, but when it's a contributory cause or a secondary cause of death, it's not currently being captured by the way that we track heat-related death in Ontario. And interestingly, the coroner's office acknowledges, first of all, that the way it's tracking death isn't capturing the scope of the problem and that it's a serious health issue. In our view, this is a problem because data, first of all, is important. It helps to define the scope of the problem accurately, so you know what you're dealing with, where you're dealing with it, who's dying exactly, and why. And it also allows you to track whether the policy responses that you're putting in place are working, whether you're making progress, whether you're helping. Other Canadian jurisdictions are better dealing with the problem, and I'll just briefly mention two. British Columbia, during the 2021 heat event, the coroner sent out a reminder. So, it wasn't a new policy, but a reminder about coding deaths based on them being accidental and not natural. And in Quebec, there's a system that kicks in during extreme heat events where medical practitioners will fill out surveys that try to get data about the deaths. So if there's a concern that it's heat related, they fill out forms that talk about whether the person had air conditioning, the temperature of the home if the person was found at home, what neighborhood they're in, what kind of house it is, that type of thing. And along with death-related data, I would just throw out there that I think we need to be considering different ways of tracking other pieces of the health puzzle here. So heat-related illness, emergency room visits, doctor's visits, that type of thing. I wanted to highlight for people in the conference that we have done a legal memorandum that looks at the broad scope of municipal power to act on climate change. The leading case on this issue is a 2001 Supreme Court of Canada decision. It's old, but it's still the leading case, and it's called Spraytech and Hudson. And it upheld a cosmetic pesticides ban by focusing, first of all, on the broad municipal powers to deal with environmental issues. The fact that municipalities can enhance protections provided by other levels of government. And the focus is really on operational conflicts so that there can't be direct conflicts and an inability to comply with laws at different levels of government, but otherwise you can enhance protection at the municipal level. And the Municipal Act in Ontario further helps with this type of broad understanding of municipal powers. And I threw on the slide, there's a few sections that are of key importance. So Section 8.1 states that the powers of municipality are to be interpreted broadly. And Section 10.2 and Section 11.2 provide for municipal powers to pass bylaws, including respecting climate change and environmental well-being in the municipality. Okay, the final thing before I pass it off to others who will talk more about adequate temperature bylaws is we did want to highlight that we've provided draft language in our report available on the CLO website because we think it helps, first of all, as a starting point. So what I've put on this first slide is a few of the definitions that we included in the draft municipal bylaw to set an adequate temperature. So the first thing is that we set a maximum temperature of 26 degrees. And the reason we did that is that we looked at the literature on the issue. There's been a lot of work already done on this issue. And 26 has been a temperature that's been kind of coalesced around in the literature. So there's lots of data on that. It's detailed in more with some detail and some references in our report. But we did choose that based on what we saw in the literature. And then there's some other definitions, dwelling unit. And then on the next slide, we've got landlord and tenant. And we're just taking those definitions from Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act. In terms of what the draft bylaw says, this is sort of the critical piece. And what it says, first of all, is that adequate and suitable cooling is to a maximum 26 degrees. And how you measure that. And the way that we framed this definition is by looking at what's done for minimum temperatures, because we see cooling based on the climate crisis, based on the health issues that arise, as simply the other side of the coin of minimum temperature requirements for tenants. And finally, the language that we've included, which we're certainly interested in thoughts on and debate, but we focus first of all on, in subsection 3, I'm going to jump down for a second, on ensuring that there's infrastructure in place. So that's kind of the crux of this, that there has to be the infrastructure in place so that different units can be cooled to a maximum of 26 degrees. Our subsection 2 notes that if tenants already are able to do that, then this doesn't apply. So that means that the infrastructure is already in place in those units. And then subsection 4 is trying to get at the idea of there being kind of like appropriate standardized equipment, so that that the equipment being used to meet these requirements are safe and standard. And then finally, we have proposed a 1-year implementation period. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and turn it back to Abby. Thank you so much.
So next we will go to speak to some wonderful folks from Hamilton who will tell us how this looks like in practice on the ground in their community. I will turn this over to folks from Acorn Hamilton, so Olivia and Stuart, as well as Claire from Hamilton Community Legal Clinic.
Yeah, hello, my name is Stuart. I'm a local advocate in Hamilton and the chair of Acorn Hamilton's East End chapter. For those of us who are unfamiliar with us, Acorn Canada, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, was founded in 2004. It is an independent grassroots organization that fights for social and economic justice for low and moderate income communities. So where did our maximum heat campaign get started? Extreme heat is a growing issue for tenants. For years, tenants have been raising the alarm on unsafe conditions in rental housing during hot summer months. Currently, there are no laws provincially nor municipally requiring access to cooling or that indoor temperatures do not exceed a certain amount. The ongoing climate crisis will mean that heat events will continue to increase in intensity, duration, and frequency. It is well documented that those disproportionately affected by heat-related deaths and illness are seniors, people with disabilities, as well as low-income, racialized, and tenant communities. So as the impacts of climate change worsen, Ontario will see an increase in the number of days over 30 degrees centigrade, an increase in the frequency and duration of heat waves, an increase in the length of the hot season. Extreme heat can also have severe consequences for people, especially vulnerable and marginalized populations. It can also be lethal. Some of the effects on the body include things like muscle spasms, fatigue, heat stroke, decreased cognitive ability. Although extreme heat can be deadly and certainly is every year, we have no way of knowing just how deadly it is, as heat-related deaths are not tracked or recorded in Ontario. So now I will pass over to Claire Freeman, who is from the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic.
Hi, everyone. I think that our role is really in supporting Acorn's advocacy that they have been doing. And we were really pleased when Sela reached out to us to collaborate with them. I think having a specialty clinic that can really help draft the bylaw and do all those things while we're doing, if you want to call it everyday tenant work, was really, really helpful in helping us push this forward. But without the voice of tenants, I just don't think that that's the only way to go. You definitely need to hear from tenants about what the lived experience is. And Acorn is an incredible group that is making sure that policymakers are hearing that. So we do poverty law, as some people will call it, housing, income support, employment, and immigration. We view that housing is a human right and a public health issue. We engage with health, and health right now is going into some reform about doing health equity. They're also looking at their own if they want to call it, utilization of services, and they're looking for ways to not have so many people come into their health stuff. So we want to make sure that if people are living healthy in their own space, then it can help with increasing people's health and also right to housing. There's a really amazing report that was done by the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. I really suggest people look at it. It's an awesome report. And basically it recognized Hamilton as the second highest community that will be experiencing the increase of global warming. So that is a reason for us to take a lead on it. We know that Hamilton will have increased heating and global warming just because of our location, also the industry that we've had in Hamilton for a long period of time. We also know that Hamilton has a high pollution rate, so therefore we have a number of people in Hamilton who have a higher than level chronic respiratory illnesses, COPDs being one of them. Lung cancer is also a big issue in Hamilton. We also know that folks who are living in older housing tend to be in certain areas of town, but also that low-income housing and health conditions sometimes go together. And sometimes the housing units themselves are older, and so therefore they in themselves are not properly insulated, have old heating systems and whatnot, and they don't have air conditioning going on within them. So the cooling centers, Hamilton, I'm just going to say Hamilton also as a community council voted on that they needed to address issues of climate change, and housing was part of it. So they do have something that they're working on, and they were looking at excessive indoor temperatures in rental housing. That is one of their ideas. So we basically jumped on that piece as well. And we also used Hamilton's own data around public health that actually recognizes the health impacts of folks during heating situations. Hamilton is looking at, and lots of communities are looking at, cooling stations. Our position is that cooling stations are not accessible to all folks, and particularly if you have comorbidity, health issues or disabilities or seniors, that having someone get on a bus to go to a cooling center when they're already not being able to sleep is really not a good housing solution. But I understand that that's one that's being put forward. Another one that's being put forward is the idea that, you know, they'll have cooling centers in a building, which again could lead to issues such as safety for some folks. Not all neighbors get along with neighbors, but also what we're seeing is that they want to put them in places like a basement with no windows or any of those things. So we're really trying to not have that be part of the solution long term. And basically, I think that what we did is we worked with the counselors, we met with them individually. We presented both the, you know, statistics of why Hamilton needed to do this, why it was important to dignity of both public health and housing. But also with CELA bringing forth the bylaw in all the other areas, I think that it allowed us to go further. And I think we're happy with the results that we got. We got everyone to agree to it. But I want to turn it back over to Olivia to go and speak more about it.
So I'll actually be taking over again.
Sorry, Stuart.
That's okay, not a problem. Yeah. So we launched our campaign with our Beat the Heat rally in September of 2022 at Hamilton City Hall. We brought the following demands to the city. First demand was for the city of Hamilton to develop and implement a maximum heat bylaw for rental housing. The bylaw to apply to all rental housing, all densities, both market and social housing. The city to consult with tenant organizations and health professionals to determine the maximum temperature for the bylaw. 26 degrees has been recognized by others as a maximum suitable indoor temperature to, you know, for 99% of people to be healthy at. And the bylaw also to be supported by Hamilton's licensing department to ensure landlord compliance, and similar to Hamilton's minimum heat bylaw in the winter, there to be a financial penalty for landlords who fail to comply with the maximum heat bylaw. Another demand was for the city of Hamilton to develop a municipal program to support retrofits of market rental housing, especially older market rental housing stock. Similar to the development of the home retrofit program for homeowners, Hamilton needs a program for landlords to reduce energy consumption and retrofit older market affordable housing stock to adapt to hotter climates. And also another demand was for the city of Hamilton to expand measures in community and public spaces for Hamilton residents to keep cool when outside the home. So things like more drinking fountains, more splash pads, improvements to Hamilton's tree canopy, especially in low and moderate income tenant communities. Our campaign did initially include a demand for heat-related deaths and illnesses to be tracked. Acorn Hamilton wrote to and subsequently met with the Chief Coroner of Ontario to discuss this. Unfortunately, the result was the Chief Coroner explaining, as best as they tried, that collecting this type of information was not feasible for their office. So we were somewhat disappointed with that result. We also met with local council members, and we had a lot of media coverage. After the election, Acorn Hamilton started meeting with city councilors at the municipal election, that is. So we met with 12 of the 15 councilors between the fall of 2022 and May 2023. Both the Canadian Environmental Law Association and the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic joined these meetings with us to impress upon councillors the severity of the issue and why it warranted municipal attention. Over this time, we also received a lot of media coverage, including 900 CHML, Global National, CBC Ontario Today, CBC The National, TVO, CBC Ottawa Morning. There was lots of media coverage locally and nationally. So. There was a Public Health Committee meeting on May 15th, 2023. At that meeting, 6 Acorn members and 6 allied environmental and community groups delegated to the committee to call on the city of Hamilton to pass policies to protect tenants from extreme heat. During the meeting, Ward 2 Councillor Kretsch brought forward a motion seconded by Ward 4 Councillor Huang that passed unanimously 10-0. The motion directed staff to prepare a report for a maximum heat bylaw in time to be included in the 2024 budget and implemented by summer of 2024. And for staff in the Healthy and Safe Communities Committee to be directed to report back on the feasibility of the development of a municipal program to support low-income tenants with the costs associated with running air conditioning units and to support retrofits of private rentals. So that brings us to today and looking forward. On October 18th, the Office of Climate Change Initiatives did a presentation to Council about the city's climate adaptation actions. The presentation listed that licensing and bylaw services, along with public health, will prepare an adequate heat bylaw for City Council to review and approve within the first quarter of 2024. Acorn Hamilton will be following the development of the bylaw very closely to ensure that it meets the community's needs and that it has all of the different parts of the framework that we want it to have. For example, the type of air conditioning that gets installed. We have concerns about that. We don't want window units. We don't want inefficient portable units. The ideal solution here would be for split systems, which is basically a mini central air system, and those can also be traditional heat pumps that work in both ways, move heat in either direction, either in or out. However, when dealing with older market rental housing stock, the heat pump is less concerning than just getting the air conditioning in, because these already have like established heating systems, and those would need to be entirely replaced, which isn't always feasible. So also recently, Acorn Hamilton, along with other groups led by local climate change group Hamilton 350, signed a joint letter for the city to make transit free on extreme heat days. This is now being investigated for feasibility for the summer of 2024 as well. So want to say thank you very much to the Low Income Energy Network for organizing today's conference. We're very grateful to be connected with organizations and individuals across the country working on this issue. If you want to get in touch with Acorn Hamilton, please feel free to email us or send us a message on social media, Facebook, Twitter, probably other places, but I don't know those ones. So, and I will now pass it back to Avi. Thank you very much.
In the next session, we will hear from some of our friends from other parts of Ontario. So Bader from Ottawa Acorn, Bernadette from Toronto Acorn, and Eric from the Kingston Providence Center will speak for a few minutes each about what this looks like in their own communities and their own experiences in advocating for their right to cooling. So I will first pass this on to Bader.
Hello, my name is Bader Abu Zahra. I'm a national board of Acorn, and I'd like to thank you for allowing me to speak on behalf of Ottawa Acorn today. So in Ottawa, Acorn has been working on climate justice since the start of the organization in 2006. So with our campaigns for repair, retrofits, and transit. But our elected leadership was inspired by the work being done by other chapters, especially Hamilton Acorn, in support of maximum heat bylaw. So since this summer, Ottawa Acorn launched our municipal campaign demands for a max heat bylaw and city program to support low-income tenants with free energy efficient air conditioning units. This started with an online email campaign that generated hundreds of emails to city councillors and mayor. As a result, city staff and council have reached out to Acorn to arrange meetings, which is a good first step. So to continue this work, Acorn created an eco tenant survey for Ottawa tenants about the state of their buildings. Out of 90 responses, Acorn has so far 60% of tenants rated the cooling of their units in the summer as poor or very poor. So the goal of the survey is to collect data to support our tenants' rights and climate justice campaign, including extreme heat. and to help Aecon build a citywide network of tenants who are motivated to take action on climate change. So Aecon is also in the process of building eco-tenant unions in apartment buildings across Ottawa to bring tenants together to advocate for their landlord to retrofit the buildings, including installing heat pumps and other measures to improve cooling. However, Aecon knows that landlords try to pass the cost of retrofit down into the tenants through above the guideline rent increases and renovictions. So the key part of Aecon's strategy is to organize tenants to push their landlords to apply for city fundings, which usually has only zero interest, and to sign affordability agreement that protects tenants' current rent and tenancy. Thank you.
Awesome, Badir. Thank you so much for that. And next, I think it's Bernadette is on the line.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Hello, thank you for inviting Toronto Acorn to speak about our local extreme heat campaign. When I got involved in Acorn, surrounding tenants' rights to cooler early this year, Toronto Acorn actually launched a campaign for municipal maximum heat bylaw in 2017. Nonetheless, our campaign has expanded and become more active in recent years. Sorry for my voice. As summers have gotten hotter and more tenants are reporting landlords preventing them from having AC units in their or charging extra fees for the units themselves. That's how I personally became involved with Acorn, the heat campaign. I've been living in my apartment since 1967, and with my 86-year-old mother, she has high blood pressure and has a bit of a heart condition. I was invited to participate in the CBC Urban Heat Project on behalf of Acorn. Excuse me, hold on, let me get a drink. And they found that my unit was clearly near the 30 degrees Celsius on average. We can't sleep because of the extreme heat. I'm exhausted, constantly tired. And despite this, my landlord charges $100 for the summer, which we're lucky. Some tenants are charged $100 a month to have AC installed, which is great because he says we can have it. But I'm on ODSP and I can't afford that. And my mom's a retired senior. So, between our two incomes, we make it through here. A little tough. But having this across the city-wide issue, the city needs to step in earlier. So earlier this year, Toronto Acorn held focus groups about extreme heat in apartment buildings with our low-income members and to identify common problems and solutions. Organized tenants unions in apartment buildings where landlords were charging extra fee for AC. Volunteer meetings where Acorn members planned to speak outside of their building area for fear of retribution from the landlord. One building on 140 Elm Ridge Drive, the landlord was charging 19 floors of tenants $150 for AC this summer. Because of the Acorn Tenant Union, the building landlord backed down. When the August Toronto Acorn organized a 100-person forum on the campaign, at the forum we launched our Beat the Heat report, which included nearly 160 survey responses and testimonies from low and moderate income people. More than a third, 36% of the tenants who did the survey said they don't have access to air conditioning. Close to 40% of the tenants state that they were asked to pay extra fees. This is why Toronto Acorn is calling on City of Toronto to introduce maximum heat bylaw and financial penalties for landlords, track heat-related deaths, and 3, create a program to support free energy efficiency in units for tenants in outside of the City of Toronto as well as in Toronto. More people are suffering each year this summer and are saying we cannot have access to AC. So this is basically what we're trying to get across to the politicians and their constituents. So thank you very much.
Awesome, Bernadette. Thank you so very much for sharing what it looks like on the ground. in Toronto, and I'll pass this now to Eric from, oh, pardon me, I don't have it in front of me. There it is, Eric from Kingston, Providence Center.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our efforts in Kingston that were inspired in large part by the work of the great folks in Hamilton. Kingston traditionally has been viewed as more affordable than other urban centers, but that's shifted in the pandemic. We had quite an influx of relatively affluent people coming from nearby major centers, in particular Toronto, and that drove up the price of living, especially in downtown. So Kingston's affordability in downtown is similar to that of Toronto or Vancouver, which has really heightened the importance and urgency of this issue. So for us, on August 8th, rather, we worked with some city councilors to bring forward a resolution that would put into motion cooling an appropriate temperature bylaw or an adequate temperature bylaw. There were 3 different community delegations, and we emphasized a few key points: that this was an urgent issue. We really wanted to see the bylaw in place by summer of 2024. We strongly suggested using 26 degrees as the upper limit, as that's been supported by research and other communities. And we really emphasized the importance of including tenants in the drafting process and including mechanisms that avoid downloading the costs to tenants. This has been a continuing issue in our area. Kingston, like many places, landlords have an outsized input on city policy. And even when laws exist to protect tenants, it's difficult to get those enforced. So this is going to be an ongoing part of our work. The motion required that staff prepare a recommendation for that bylaw by the first quarter of 2024. What makes that motion a little different from some of the other communities we've heard from is that it's not exclusive to tenants. So the city councilors drafted a resolution that would also require looking at supporting other residents, including homeowners, in retrofitting their housing to improve its habitability. And so that motion passed unanimously. I think that the inclusion of non-tenants could be a complicating factor. On one hand, it's good to make climate action as broad as possible and to support programs, especially with federal and provincial funding that can retrofit housing. At the same time, I think we'll have to keep a close eye on this to make sure that the work of this bylaw or the emphasis of this bylaw isn't watered down and that it does protect the most vulnerable people. Some of our next steps are organizing with tenants on this and other issues. So we just concluded a survey of our own that had over 400 responses from different tenants about the issues most affecting them. When the report comes back to City Council in Q1 of 2024, we're going to mobilize advocates from all sorts of communities and domains, including healthcare professionals, students, and so on. We also want to expand the vision of what it means to be green and equitable in Kingston. So, this is not just about looking at air conditioning, but we see this as part of a broader step toward ecological justice and ecological resilience. And we look forward to coordinating with people from across Ontario, including with the NDP caucus at Queen's Park. We've had some very promising discussions with them, in part because of a campaign started by my predecessor here at the Providence Centre, Jeremy Malloy, who started a campaign called The Heat is On with the Ontario Federation of Labour. And as many of you probably know, there is a new draft regulation for workplace heat safety that's been presented by the current provincial government. So it's very exciting to see some action happening on that. And I'm hopeful that we can make work progress for both tenants and for workers across Ontario as we build up from the grassroots in our municipalities. Thank you so much, and I'm going to pass it back to Abby.
Next, I would love to introduce Sarah Miller and Alexandra Godmurray, who had some really interesting things to say about heat pumps versus air conditioning and how cooling solutions can actually perhaps be an entry point into thinking about including vulnerable households in decarbonizing heating at home. But I don't want to give away too much. Take it away, Sarah and Alexandra. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks for having us on this. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation alongside so many extremely effective advocacy groups and organizers. So it's great to be part of this. Alex and I will just speak briefly about some of our research that we've done on heat pumps as a cooling solution and some of the barriers that are holding a lot of households back, particularly lower income households, from being able to access these technologies. Next slide, please, Alex. So really briefly, I'm sure many people are familiar with the basics of heat pumps, but just to cover them really quickly. So heat pumps are a home heating and cooling technology that we're seeing being adopted across Canada increasingly. And they operate basically by moving heat. They use electricity to move heat from one space to another, rather than generating heat. So in the winter, heat pumps provide heating by drawing heat from the outside air and pumping it into indoor spaces. And then in the summer, they operate in the reverse, so they can extract thermal energy from the indoor air and move it outdoors. So this allows them both to operate as a heating system and as a cooling system, as an air conditioner. So they provide heating and cooling in one device, in one unit. Heat pumps are extremely efficient. So we see that heat pumps can operate at 2 to 5 times the efficiency of even the most efficient alternatives, like the newest gas furnaces. And as a result of this extreme efficiency, heat pumps produce significant savings on energy bills for most households, which is something that Alex will talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. Next slide, please, Alex. So heat pumps are, we think, an essential tool in both dealing with the consequences of climate change, as well as in helping us avoid, further significant negative consequences by helping us decarbonize our home and building stock. As many people have spoken about already, obviously we're in an era where climate impacts are worsening and worsening quickly. And extreme heat, we know, is the deadliest climate-related disaster. And we've already seen it take far too many lives in Canada just in recent years. So we urgently need policies and technologies that protect people from these impacts. And we know, as many have spoken eloquently to already, that space cooling can no longer be seen as a nice to have. It's a necessity and a life-saving necessity. This is not to say that other measures aren't also important. So we know that things like building design, urban greening, measures to provide cooling in public spaces are all important, but we know from our research and the research that others have done that mechanical cooling has to be a key part of the puzzle to keep people safe in their homes. And heat pumps are a technology that are uniquely well suited to meeting this dual challenge of adapting to existing climate impacts and helping us meet our net zero targets. Because they have the same ability to cool as air conditioners, and because they significantly reduce energy and emissions from home heating. So they do this so they're able to provide protection from extreme heat in a way that doesn't actually make the problem worse. Whereas we know that when households buy new air conditioners, they tend to get locked into existing fossil fuel heating infrastructure, whereas heat pumps free them from that while also providing cooling. So in terms of the main barriers that are holding households back, and particularly renter households and lower income households, we've assessed a number of barriers that are still preventing wider uptake of this technology, though we are seeing that uptake has accelerated in recent years. So first of all, heat pumps are still a relatively unfamiliar technology for many households. And so we see this manifesting in the fact that consumer confidence is still undermined by a lack of familiarity with this technology and somewhat unclear information. So there are still information gaps that persist around heat pump performance and cost. And people might get contradictory advice and information from different contractors, different sources that they look at online around whether a heat pump could work for them. And exacerbating this challenge is the fact that often heating and cooling replacement decisions are made with quite a high degree of urgency when existing equipment fails, which makes it a lot harder to make a decision to install a technology that might be relatively less familiar with or that people might perceive as risky. The second barrier that we've identified is to do with higher upfront costs. So even though, as Alex will speak to, we know that heat pumps produce significant savings on energy bills, they do still have higher upfront costs than alternative traditional air conditioning or heating systems. And this is a significant barrier, in particular for lower income households who might not be able to bear the higher upfront cost while they wait for the savings to accrue through lower operating costs. Next point, please, Alex. Also, so thirdly, there is a significant amount of programming that exists at different levels of government. As I'll speak to in a minute, it doesn't capture all households equally, but it's also for the households that are eligible. It's extremely complex often. It forces households to navigate multiple levels of government, different eligibility criteria in terms of equipment, different timelines for getting reimbursed. And also most programs require that households carry the cost until and through the installation process and then get reimbursed after the fact. So this is obviously a psychological barrier for all households who have to deal with the uncertainty of whether they'll actually be approved after already spending a significant amount of money. And again, it's a particular barrier for lower income households who may just not be able to carry this cost. And then finally, we also see significant structural barriers that limit access for many households. This is, of course, most relevant to the conversation that we're having today. So in particular, renter households and people who don't live in single family homes are often ineligible for existing programs. This isn't true across the board, but many of the most significant programs at the federal and provincial levels target owner-occupied households and single detached homes. So if you live in a condo or if you're a renter, your landlord may not be eligible for the rebate programs, even if they are motivated to install a heat pump. So, and also the fact that for renter households, many of the issues come from the fact that there are misaligned incentives between the tenants and the landlords, where renters typically pay the energy bills and landlords typically pay for the installation of heating systems and cooling systems. So there's misaligned incentive to have the landlord expend extra money at the outset when the benefits in terms of lower energy bills tend to accrue to the occupants. So as a result of these structural barriers, we know that many of those who might be the most vulnerable to extreme heat, as well as to rising energy bills, are actually currently the least able to reap the benefits of making the switch to a heat pump. And Alex, I will pass it over to you to talk about some of our research results.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So Sarah just told you about what makes heat pumps great and what barriers have slowed adoption. And I want to talk to you about how heat pumps intersect with the discussion we've been having today about expanding active cooling. Right? As people talk about, there's a real need to expand active cooling in Canada, which is crucial to protecting people, especially low-income people, from the effects of extreme heat. The question we have is, what technology are we going to use to meet that need for cooling? And basically, the claim we make in our report is that if we rely on air conditioning, we're missing a big opportunity. And that's because air conditioning and heat pumps, not only can heat pumps cool, but AC and heat pumps are basically the same machines, especially when we're talking about the most basic common models that are most likely to be available to low-income households. They're literally mechanically almost the same machine, with the difference just being valves that allow the machine to change the direction that it's pumping heat in. So all the benefits that Sarah was talking about, reduced bills, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, are locked behind this really small additional cost to make an air conditioner and a heat pump for manufacturers. So it's about a few $100s to make a heat pump instead of an air conditioner. And when that gets to the consumer, that's about a $700 difference for like a common unit that many people would be buying. But that small upfront difference really matters in the long run. And so we did a modeling exercise looking across Canada at homes with different kinds of heat, different kinds of existing heat, and said, what if they got a heat pump instead of a central air conditioner next time they replace their central air conditioner? What would the effects of that be? And before I show the modeling, I just want to remark that the stakes of this question, whether people get ACs or heat pumps, are really high, because right now in Ontario, last year, there were 8,000 new ducted heat pumps installed the whole year, but there were 4,000 ducted air conditioners installed each week. And because these pieces of equipment last for so long, if you get a new ducted AC, that's going to last for the next 15, 20 years. You're locking yourself out of that decision. And renters who don't get to pick their HVAC equipment, as Sarah mentioned, are getting locked out without even realizing or having control over that. So when we modeled these effects, we modeled them for all of Canada, but I'm going to talk specifically about some impacts we modeled in Ontario. So looking ahead to 2030, so we model it for each year with a changing electricity grid. We see substantial bill savings for houses, regardless of what kind of system they're currently using for heat, which you can use alongside the heat pump. So houses using electric heating see the biggest savings, over $1,000 per year, but even households using efficient gas appliances tend to be the lowest cost heating model now, would see savings from using a heat pump, because the heat pump can take on some of that heating load when it's cost effective to do so. We also see major greenhouse gas emission savings. So as Sarah mentioned, part of the conflict is that just installing cooling adds demand to the grid, but doesn't actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the efficiency of heat pumps means that depending on your existing system, you're going to be saving tons of CO2 emissions for all the households that install this. And these benefits are going to be really large when they accrue over time. So if we required new AC to be heat pumps instead, if we essentially required AC to have a heating capability, that would be $2.6 billion in additional upfront costs over the next decade, but that would produce more than $7 billion of energy bill reductions over the same period. And it would produce another $4 billion in terms of climate benefits converted to money using the social cost of carbon. And that's equivalent to 3.7 million more heat pumps installed and 13.7 million metric tons of emissions reductions. So these are major benefits which are on the table if we get heat pumps installed instead of AC. And again, that $2.6 billion at the front looks like a large number and is a large number, but for individual households, we're really talking about a pretty small cost delta. We're talking about $700 per unit, an amount that the government is well placed to cover, either for consumers directly or upstream. So we talk in our report about different ways of implementing this, and I'll get to that in a second, but I just want to emphasize that these bill savings are obviously going to be really important for those facing energy poverty. Making sure that only heat pumps are available instead of AC guarantees that renters get this technology, even though they can't control their HVAC decision. If the landlord has to get a heat pump and make sure they get access to that. And of course, as I said, the government still needs to ensure upfront affordability. The report, I'll post a link to it at the end, but it's called The Cool Way to Heat Homes. And we lay out a few different ways you could implement a regulation like this. But briefly, you could just have a national mandate that said that all central air conditioners in Canada also have to have heating capability. You could have local governments use performance standards and building codes to say that air conditioners have to have heating capability. Vancouver has already done this and found it to be successful. And also the federal or provincial government could offer upstream incentives to manufacturers or distributors to stop selling ducted ACs and sell heat pumps instead. But whichever route you take, making sure that low-income people aren't locked out of this important new technology is going to be really important for achieving LIEN's goals of expanding cooling access while also maintaining energy affordability. Thank you very much.
All I want to say is thank you from the bottom of all our hearts at LIEN, at CELA, and ACTO, and all organizations involved in pulling this together. One, huge thanks to all the presenters for your gift of time. I know 3 hours on a Thursday afternoon is no one's idea of a fun time, but you were all here, you were all present, and you all showed up, and you're sharing your expertise and your experiences, and that matters a lot. Thank you to Low Income Energy Network and CELA for holding this space. I know in the past we used to do in-person events, but honestly, it seems like we've been able to, by going virtual, we've been able to expand our reach, and it's really cool to see folks from all parts of Canada and perhaps even beyond come and spend time with us and learn about this stuff. Thanks to everyone who's attended and spent time with us, and for folks who may be watching this now in the recording. Thanks for participating and for being open to learning new things and for sharing your own experiences as well. And then and finally, thanks to Z for all the hard work that goes into putting this together, for working hard for months on end, coming up with to the second, pinpoint accuracy for how the presentations have to be ordered, who do we invite, how does this all line up, getting the timelines, everything right. I know Z's been working extremely hard, so huge thanks to Z for pulling all this all together. I'll just leave you with this thought, and just it's hard to summarize a day like this, but I think what what I'm taking away from this is that cooling is a right, and we need to work across scales of government and across our communities, come up with data, talking points, lived experiences, and examples, so that right to cooling is enforced at different levels of government, and then we align policies around that right. So this is not just a nice idea; it's a fundamental right. Is the direction it seems like we're all going, and having these policies baked in at different levels of government also would help with political durability and to enact long-term change. It's very exciting to see so many people actively engaged on this topic. I've said this before: it's not as cool, as fun as electric vehicles or solar panels and this and that, but thanks for turning on the heat on the right to cooling.
I really want to thank everyone for attending today, speaking, participating in the breakout sessions. And if you want to keep up with us or inform us of the work and advocacy that you're doing in your communities, please reach out. Let us know how we can help you as well. And let us know if you have any ideas for next year's conference. Who knows, we might be further along on this topic. Thank you.